It's not too far short of a couple of years now since I reviewed the Yoko yoke from Virtual Fly, and it still has central position in my cockpit. 2 years on, I thought I'd do a bit of an update, kind of a long-term test, but also just a couple of extra things to point out along the way. Now, it's kind of difficult to get a good view of this yoke in my cockpit, so I think before we move on, I'm going to remove this central control panel just so we can see what's going on. So that's given us a slightly better view of the yoke. We'll take it out in a second, get a closer look still. I mean, in general terms, there really isn't very much more to say about this yoke than I said in the original video. It's a completely reliable, robust, solid, beautifully smooth yoke with, you know, just about the ideal kind of feel. Well, I'm saying ideal, obviously depending on the kind of flying you do, any yoke design is a little bit of a compromise, particularly if we're talking about realism. You know, this is, I guess, on the kind of scale of a Cessna style yoke or a Beechcraft yoke or a you know, Mooney general aviation yoke essentially. If you're looking at something from a Boeing 737, that yoke is substantially bigger in terms of width in particular. You know, there's a certain concession to genericness, but the quality of this is, you know, second to none. It's a completely cast aluminium handle. It's very smoothly finished. It's got a very long stroke, 5 3/4 inches, don't forget, 14 centimeters. One thing that people have complained about, I don't think this is an issue, it doesn't have a 90-degree or 180 lock-to-lock travel. Now, people have criticised that because it's different to some yokes in real life. Now, not all yokes have a 180-degree travel. Your Cessna style yoke does, but in practice, you know, even in simulating general aviation, in the most tricky of landing conditions where you will be approaching potentially full deflection of the ailerons and indeed the elevators, even under those circumstances, that is barely a valid criticism, and I would suggest it's not even worth considering as a counter-argument to the suitability of this yoke. So again, that smoothness is undeniable. There's no central notching at all, and it's well known that this yoke runs on very high quality, low friction bearings. Now, I haven't dismantled this and I haven't seen any engineering specs, but it feels like it's on ball races. I have heard talk of linear roller bearings, so the precise mechanical details of this are something I can't comment on, but it doesn't matter. You know, there's just absolutely no detectable stiction, if you like, stop-start movement in either of the axes. So there you go. That's all I'm going to say about the yoke. We'll do a demo in a while for reasons that will become apparent. Now, one thing I wanted to address specifically in this review, or this re-review, is the one niggle that I had with this yoke, if you remember back to the original review, was the clamping system. Now, I hope you can see this clearly enough, and just to remind you of the problem, the clamp is, I'll get this out and show you in just a second. The clamp anchors the yoke at one point which is literally about 1.5 centimeters or perhaps 2 centimeters from the front edge of the table, and it has rubber feet, and that's supposed to stop it twisting and sliding. Now, it doesn't. The problem is, you can see I'm very easily moving that just by turning the shaft. Now, of course, if you're operating this with 2 hands, that's not an issue, that twisting torque. But generally you don't operate it with 2 hands, you operate it with 1 hand. I'm in the captain's seat, so I'm flying it with my left hand, my right hand on the power levers. And so when I'm pulling and pushing with 1 hand, we do get that movement. Now, the other issue is when you approach full up elevator deflection, as you would do potentially in the flare, the yoke actually tips forward potentially. Now, that's not a huge amount of tip, but it does tip, and of course if it tips, that takes the rearmost rubber feet off the deck, and it just means that twisting is so much more likely. So let's have a look at why that happens. If I take off the clamping mechanism, now there's no denying this is a very high quality piece of equipment in terms of a clamp. This is very thick steel, and you know, it's kind of hefty. So you can see that the back wall of the table is going to butt up against this back plate of the clamp here, and so we have this very limited amount of deflection, displacement from the edge of the table. It's 1.5 inches. It's about 3 centimeters to the center of that screw pressure point. And just for completeness, we've got a maximum depth of just about 4 centimeters. Your maximum depth of about 4 centimeters, or about 1.5 inches in terms of the thickness of the table that you can mount this on. Now that's not the only way to mount the yoke, and if I bring it out and we get a look at it, so here we've got the yoke removed, and that clamp is not the only way to mount it. Look at that mounting. So the clamp goes into those 2 slots on the front. Oops. And you should be able to see that the problem there is how very close to the front edge of the yoke that mounting point is. Now it's not the only way to mount the yoke, and when you buy this you also get, if I just show you, these 4 long screws with, I guess these are kind of thumb screws, and if I just take a couple of these, and these can be screwed into, well, let me put 2 of them in, 4 different holes on the underside of the yoke. So you've got 2 at the front here and 2 at the rear. Now that's much more secure in terms of a way to mount it, and you would mount this to your table by drilling holes through the table or some other version of that. Now the problem is not everybody wants to do that, mutilate their furniture to mount the yoke, because if you're building yourself a bona fide cockpit, there'd be no problem doing that. But for the casual home simmer, perhaps someone who wants to mount and unmount their yoke from time to time, that's not a realistic proposition. But this being Virtual Fly, they haven't rested on their laurels, they've done something about this problem. So what have they done? Well, they've produced an alternative to this original clamp, and I have one here. Now if, like me, you've bought your fair share of add-ons and accessories for flight sim equipment, you might have fairly low expectations. But this being Virtual Fly, they don't do things by halves. And I think it's fair to say this new clamp is somewhat over-engineered. This, if I compare this to the original clamp, if I can find it, hang on. There really is very little comparison in terms of the scale. This is just unbelievably robust. This is made from 6mm thick solid steel, and it weighs, now bearing in mind the Yoko yoke itself weighs about 6 or 7 kilos, I haven't measured that precisely. This bracket alone weighs 2.5 kilos, slightly more, and it's got 4 screw holes in the corners, at the corners here, and those match up precisely with the screw holes on the bottom of the yoke, and you do get 4 screws, and they're Allen screws. You get an Allen key to attach those. But most significantly, well, in fact I say that, but I've got a feeling the weight itself, the additional weight, is probably somewhat deliberate. By increasing the weight of the yoke, you're increasing the inertia and decreasing that tendency for it to slide around. Now, having said that, on the bottom of this as well, we've got some very thick, perhaps 4 or 5 millimeters thick rubber. Now, those rubber strips cover the full span of the rear of the yoke and each side, with the exception of where the screws are mounted. For some reason the rubber doesn't extend to the front span of the yoke body. Not sure why that would be, but most significantly, put the two clamps side by side. Can you see this? It's the difference, not only the difference in how far back that mounting screw hits the table edge, it's the fact that we've got two of those. So the inner one is still further inboard of the original. It's also got a larger face to the plunger or to the screw, if you like. But then there's another screw which is pretty much towards, I guess, the centre of the yoke. Let me just check that out on the floor. Yeah, that's pretty much in the centre of the yoke. Now, you know, as before, this is a premium product and this clamp doesn't come cheap. You know, I had wondered if this was a new thing that was included as standard with the newer yokes, but it's not. It's an optional extra. This costs you €82 plus shipping by Federal Express, which is, so there's about £75 plus shipping. It's not going to be much short of £100 on top of the price of the yoke. I think what we'll do now is we'll mount this on the yoke and we'll see how it works out in practice. So we've got the clamp mounted. Here it is. You should be able to get sight of that. This thing weighs a ton now. Now, another thing I forgot to mention with the features of this clamp, the throw is longer as well. The original throw, remember, was about 2 inches. This one is 3.5 inches, or about 7.5 centimeters. So you can use a thicker table or piece of timber or whatever you're mounting it on. So let's get this back in the cockpit. This is going to be kind of tricky because it's a bit cramped. Need to connect the USB up again as well. As we do that, actually, last thing I forgot to mention, a consequence of mounting this new clamp is if your mounting is marginal. I mean, here this is kind of marginal, fortunately not too marginal in terms of how tight that gap is. I'm having to insert the yoke in. We lose about a centimetre, or in fact we gain about a centimetre in height. It's a bit less than that because half of that compresses, it's the foam. But don't forget, we've got 6mm of steel and then we've got about 5mm of foam. So we kind of lose that. That might be a deal breaker for you, depending on your mounting. Yeah, there we go. Right, let's just centre that up. Okay. Now actually, at first I thought that was continuing to tip forward. If I actually look at the table, what's happening is the table is flexing up and down as I pull the yoke. I kid you not. So the yoke is not moving, there is no tilting happening. You know, it's kind of, it's not sliding. I'm not able to, I'm doing it with 2 hands. You know, I'm not trying my absolute maximum here to tilt this yoke, to slide this yoke. But you can see it's kind of rocking on those rubber strips is all it's doing. You know, it's very, very slightly, it's like a shock absorber rather than actually moving. And that's not going to move, you know. I'm pulling it to the stop there, and I mean you wouldn't pull it any higher than that. All that's happening is the table edge is bending forwards very slightly. The yoke is not moving. So we're just taking this newly mounted yoke for a spin to see how it performs. Just going to do a very quick approach. We're in Chicago, the windy city, and true to form we've got a 10 knot 90-degree crosswind onshore, which is going to be from our left. There's a nice Chicago skyline. This is Orbix scenery. This is the first Orbix X-Plane product ever. This is Meeks Field, which is of course closed but familiar long since as the home of Flight Simulator. So we're going to need a bit of a crab here until the last minute. Trying to get this trimmed. Trying to hold it off, dip in the left wing. I don't have the knack of steering on the ground in crosswind. But that was a passable approach, and the yoke performed admirably. No slipping and sliding, no tipping. Solid as a rock, you might say. So that's the Yoko. It flies superbly. As always, it's 2 years old, more or less, and it's as good as new. And I certainly recommend this as my yoke of choice. I'm not going to dwell on the price. We know this is a big ticket item. This is a pro or semi-pro piece of equipment, and the quality lives up to that. You know, the attention to detail, the quality of materials and construction, quality of design, the thought that's gone into this is second to, well, okay, I can't say second to none because I haven't tried every other piece of equipment out there, but in my experience, second to none. And I have tried quite a few yokes. The only thing remaining to say, I won't go through this in detail. If you watched along the original review, I mentioned that VirtualFly provides a memory stick with some software on. That's very rudimentary software that gives you the ability to create mapping curves for the Yoko. There's a newer version of that software, and this memory stick is a different one. This is the one I got with the TQ6 quadrant, but no doubt you get this with the Yoko yoke these days as well. If you watch my TQ6 review, that piece of software was featured. That's a generic software that caters for all the VirtualFly devices, sorry, all the desktop control devices, and the Yoko is included in that. Now the only reason I'm mentioning this, there is a new feature which has been added to the Yoko via that program, and that feature is it can emulate a hat switch. Now the Yoko yoke, one of the criticisms that you will see levelled at the yoke is it doesn't have a hat switch, which is kind of unusual for this kind of device. It's not something I miss, because I suppose rather unusually I simply fly from the cockpit and I rarely use the outside views, if ever. Certainly don't use the hat switch for panning the view, but some people do that, and actually if I use the outside views it would be nice to have a hat switch. So with the VirtualFly Test and Calibrate program, if you have that running in the background, it can emulate a hat switch by modifying the actions of the two paddle switches, which are normally used for rudder trim on the right and elevator trim on the left. And if you have that set up, you simply press and hold the leftmost push to talk switch, and then you can pan the view up and down with the left paddle switch. If you click and hold the right push to talk switch, you can then rotate the view left and right with the rightmost paddle switch. So that's a partial emulation, if you like, of a hat switch, and that might be something you want to experiment with. So that's about all I can think of to say about the Yoko yoke. Excellent piece of equipment. So a very pleasant experience of flying your aircraft using this yoke. It's kind of difficult to imagine what they could do to improve it, but you never know, so watch this space.